People joke about millennials all the time. They're called entitled, burned out, overly sensitive, the generation that killed napkins, cable TV, and diamonds. But almost nobody asks the more interesting question. What actually happened to wire an entire generation this way? Because millennials born roughly between 1981 and 1996 didn't just grow up during change. They grew up through contradiction. They were raised to believe that if they worked hard enough, everything would fall into place. Then they became adults just as that promise started falling apart. And that contradiction quietly shaped how they think about money, success, relationships, work, and even happiness. Picture this. It's 1998. You're 12 years old. Your teacher tells you that you can become absolutely anything you want. Your parents tell you that college is the key to success. Television tells you the future is bright. The economy seems unstoppable. Everyone around you believes the next generation will have it even better. So you believe it too. You study harder, join clubs, volunteer, build your resume before you even know what a resume is. Then, just as you're entering adulthood, the world changes. The dot-com bubble bursts. A few years later, 9/11 changes the country overnight. Then comes the Great Recession. Companies stop hiring. Student debt keeps growing. Homes become harder to afford. The finish line you were promised keeps moving farther away. Psychologists sometimes call this expectation violation. When reality repeatedly falls short of deeply held beliefs, people don't simply become disappointed. They become chronically uncertain about whether they're ever doing enough. That's why so many millennials have accomplished more than previous generations at the same age, yet still feel like they're falling behind. Because they aren't comparing themselves to other people. They're comparing themselves to the future they were promised. And maybe no generation has been caught between two worlds quite like millennials. They were the last generation to have an almost completely analog childhood. They played outside until the streetlights came on. They memorized their friends' phone numbers. They rented movies from Blockbuster. They passed handwritten notes in school. But before they even reached adulthood, smartphones completely transformed daily life. Millennials remember what it felt like to disappear, to leave the house without anyone knowing where they were, to make mistakes that weren't permanently recorded online. Then, almost overnight, everything became visible. Every vacation, every relationship, every promotion, every mistake. For the first time in history, an entire generation had to learn adulthood while being watched by the internet. Researchers studying social comparison have found that constant exposure to carefully curated lives increases feelings of inadequacy, even among psychologically healthy adults. And millennials were the first generation to experience this every single day. That's one reason they often seem obsessed with self-improvement. Morning routines, productivity systems, fitness tracking, budgeting apps, meditation, podcasts, online courses. From the outside, it can look exhausting, but underneath it all is a quiet belief. If life isn't working, maybe I just haven't optimized myself enough. Then there's work. People often say millennials don't have loyalty, but that's not quite true. They grew up watching parents lose careers after decades of dedication. They saw layoffs happen without warning. They watched entire industries disappear. Then they entered a job market where pensions were fading, promotions were slower, and switching companies often paid better than staying loyal. So, millennials didn't stop believing in hard work. They stopped believing hard work guaranteed security. That's why many of them dream about passive income, remote work, side businesses, and financial independence. It's not always about becoming rich. Sometimes it's simply about never feeling trapped. Their relationship with technology shaped them in another unexpected way. Millennials were the first generation to experience dating through screens. Instead of wondering whether someone liked you, suddenly there were new questions. Why did they leave me on red? Why are they typing, then stopping? Why did they like my photo but ignore my message? Tiny digital signals started carrying enormous emotional weight. Human relationships became filled with invisible information that previous generations never had to interpret. And perhaps that's why millennials gained a reputation for overthinking. Not because they're naturally anxious, but because modern communication trained them to search constantly for hidden meaning. Even nostalgia works differently for millennials. They don't just miss old television shows, they miss an entire way of experiencing life. Waiting a week for the next episode, burning CDs for friends, logging onto MSN Messenger after school, the excitement of renting a movie on Friday night, having nobody expect an instant reply. Psychologists have found that nostalgia becomes especially powerful during periods of rapid technological change. The faster the world changes, the more emotionally valuable familiar memories become, and few generations have watched the world transform as quickly as millennials have. Then came another defining moment: COVID-19. Many millennials had finally reached the point where life seemed stable. Careers were growing, families were expanding, long-term plans were finally beginning to take shape. Then the world stopped. Once again, certainty disappeared. For many millennials, it wasn't the first time history had interrupted adulthood. It was simply another reminder that stability can disappear overnight. That's one reason millennials often prepare for worst-case scenarios: emergency funds, backup careers, extra certifications, multiple income streams. Not because they expect disaster, but because experience has taught them that certainty rarely lasts. Perhaps the biggest misunderstanding about millennials is that people mistake emotional openness for emotional weakness. Previous generations often believed strength meant hiding your emotions. Millennials grew up during a cultural shift that encouraged talking about anxiety, depression, burnout, and mental health. They became the first generation to normalize therapy, the first generation to openly discuss emotional well-being. Some people call that oversharing, others call it emotional intelligence. Either way, it reflects a generation trying to solve problems that previous generations often learned to ignore. The truth is, millennials weren't raised for the world they inherited. They were prepared for a future that changed before they even arrived. They learned to dream without limits, then discovered limits everywhere. They were told that success was a destination. Instead, they found themselves constantly adapting to a moving target. Maybe that's why they seem anxious. Not because they're weaker than previous generations, but because they've spent their entire adult lives rebuilding plans that history kept rewriting. Millennials may not become known as the richest generation or the most powerful, but they may become remembered as the generation that quietly reinvented adulthood while living through one historic disruption after another. And perhaps that's the hidden psychology of millennials: not entitlement, not laziness, not fragility, but extraordinary adaptability disguised as exhaustion. If this video made you see millennials a little differently, consider subscribing. And if you'd like to support more deep dives into the hidden psychology that shapes all of us, becoming a channel member is one of the best ways to help. I genuinely appreciate it.